stone walls remember what people try to forget. Across medieval Europe, castles rose not only as symbols of power, but as machines of control. Their towers promised safety, their gates authority, their halls order. Yet behind these promises existed spaces that were never meant to be seen, never meant to be understood, and certainly never meant to be questioned. Rooms without clear purpose, chambers without records, spaces designed not for comfort, but for obedience, fear, and silence. When we imagine medieval castles, we think of great halls filled with banners and feasts, of armored knights and roaring fires, but castles were not built for romance. They were built to dominate landscapes and people alike. Every corridor, every staircase, every sealed doorway served a function, and some of those functions were deliberately hidden. The strangest rooms in medieval castles were not accidents of architecture. They were intentional. They were responses to paranoia, to superstition, to political instability, and to a constant fear of betrayal. In an age without forensic science, without modern law enforcement, power was maintained through secrecy and psychological control. A ruler did not merely need to defeat enemies on the battlefield. He needed to break them mentally. Many castles contained rooms that do not appear on official plans. Narrow chambers embedded within walls. Windowless spaces accessible only through concealed passages. Floors that sloped subtly downward, guiding blood, water, or waste toward unseen drains. These were not design flaws. They were statements. In medieval thought, space itself could punish. Consider the obsession with confinement. Medieval justice relied heavily on imprisonment, yet castles were never designed as prisons in the modern sense. Instead, incarceration took many forms. Some prisoners were placed in oubliettes, vertical shafts often mistaken for dungeons. The name comes from the French word oublier, meaning to forget, and that was precisely their purpose. An oubliette was not meant for rehabilitation or interrogation. It was meant to erase. Victims were lowered through a small opening at the top and left there, sometimes for days, sometimes for months. Light was minimal. Air was scarce. Food, if provided at all, was lowered unpredictably. The psychological damage began long before the body failed, but not all oubliettes were simple pits. Some were carefully engineered rooms designed to amplify despair. Curved walls distorted sound, making it impossible to judge distance or time. Moisture seeped constantly through stone, creating a sensation of decay. In some castles, the floor was layered with straw that was never replaced, turning the room into a living, breathing reminder of neglect. What makes these rooms especially disturbing is their proximity to normal life. In several castles, oubliettes were located directly beneath chapels or great halls. Above, prayers were spoken, feasts were held, music echoed. Below, human beings slowly disappeared. The contrast was not coincidental. It was symbolic. Power did not hide its cruelty. It built over it. Other rooms served a different kind of terror. Some chambers were designed specifically for interrogation, long before torture was systematized into formal institutions. These spaces often featured low ceilings, forcing captives to crouch. Walls were intentionally uneven, creating disorientation. In certain castles, iron rings were embedded at irregular heights, allowing bodies to be restrained in painful positions for extended periods. Yet what is most unsettling is how subtle these rooms could be. Unlike later torture chambers filled with devices, many medieval interrogation spaces relied on anticipation. The room itself was the weapon. Darkness, silence, cold, and uncertainty did more damage than blades. In some regions, especially within the Holy Roman Empire, castles contained rooms known informally as listening chambers. These were small spaces concealed within walls, connected by narrow slits or channels that carried sound from adjacent rooms. Lords used them to spy on guests, rivals, and even family members. Conversations whispered in confidence were never truly private. These chambers reflect a world obsessed with loyalty and betrayal. Marriage alliances shifted constantly. Nobles plotted against one another. A careless word could mean execution. Architecture adapted accordingly. Stone became an ear. There were also rooms shaped by superstition rather than strategy. Medieval Europe was a world deeply afraid of the unseen. Evil spirits, demons, curses, and divine punishment were accepted realities. Some castles contained chambers believed to neutralize supernatural threats. These rooms often broke architectural norms. Doors faced unusual directions. Windows were placed asymmetrically. Symbols were carved into stone, sometimes later plastered over but never removed. One particularly strange feature found in several castles is the presence of sealed rooms with no clear entrance. Archaeologists have discovered chambers fully enclosed within walls, accessible only during construction. Their purpose remains debated. Some believe they were ritual spaces, sealed intentionally to trap malevolent forces. Others suggest they were symbolic sacrifices, rooms offered to God or fate to protect the rest of the structure. In medieval thinking, a building was alive. It needed to be balanced, appeased, protected. Not all strange rooms were hidden. Some were openly displayed, yet deeply unsettling. Certain castles featured rooms where condemned prisoners were paraded before execution. These chambers were designed for visibility, not containment. Elevated platforms, narrow walkways, and forced sightlines ensured that everyone present understood the outcome of disobedience. These rooms were theaters of power. Even private chambers could carry disturbing purposes. Royal bedrooms often contained hidden exits, false walls, and secret staircases. While these are sometimes romanticized as escape routes, their existence speaks to constant fear. Rulers did not trust their own guards. They did not trust their guests. They sometimes did not trust their families. In some castles, a ruler's bedchamber was connected directly to a small reinforced room with no windows. These spaces could serve as panic rooms in times of siege or as places to hide valuable objects. But in several cases, records suggest darker uses. These rooms allowed rulers to conduct secret meetings, hold prisoners temporarily, or carry out actions never meant to be witnessed. Silence was the greatest luxury of power. As we peel back the stone layers of medieval castles, one truth becomes unavoidable. These structures were not only fortresses against external enemies. They were instruments designed to control those within. The strangest rooms were not anomalies. They were reflections of a world where fear governed daily life, where authority relied on mystery, and where architecture became a psychological weapon. And this is only the beginning. Because beyond the oubliettes and hidden chambers lie rooms even more disturbing. Spaces where punishment blended with ritual, where engineering crossed into cruelty, where the line between justice and obsession vanished entirely. The deeper we go, the darker the castle becomes. There is a point where architecture stops responding to fear and begins to enforce belief. In the medieval world, punishment was rarely separated from morality. Justice was not only about correcting behavior, but about restoring cosmic balance. Sin disrupted order. Crime offended God. And castles, as centers of authority, became places where this worldview was carved into stone. Some of the strangest rooms ever built were designed not merely to restrain the body, but to confront the soul. In several regions of Europe, castles contained chambers associated with ordeal. These rooms were used to determine guilt through suffering rather than evidence. A person accused of a crime might be forced to endure extreme heat, cold, or pain under the belief that divine forces would protect the innocent and expose the guilty. The room itself became a testing ground for God's judgment. These chambers were often circular or irregularly shaped, lacking clear corners. Fire pits were placed centrally. Drainage channels ran outward like veins. The design ensured that the spectacle could be witnessed while remaining controlled. Survival was interpreted as innocence. Failure was confirmation. What is unsettling is not only the brutality, but the confidence. There was no doubt in the system. The room did not question. It confirmed. Connected to these ordeal chambers were spaces for confinement during spiritual uncertainty. Individuals accused of heresy, witchcraft, or blasphemy were sometimes held in rooms designed to strip them of identity. Mirrors were absent. Personal belongings were forbidden. Walls were bare. The goal was not interrogation, but erasure. In these rooms, time lost meaning. Days blended together. Prayer became compulsory, but unsupervised. Confession was expected, yet never sufficient. The architecture enforced introspection until the occupant either broke or complied. Some never left. One of the most disturbing categories of strange rooms are those tied to execution rituals that blurred into ceremony. In certain castles, executions were preceded by symbolic acts performed in dedicated chambers. The condemned might be washed, dressed, or marked. These rooms were calm, ordered, almost peaceful. The purpose was not kindness, it was control. By imposing ritual, authorities transformed killing into duty. The room framed death as necessary, even sacred. Witnesses were reassured. Responsibility dissolved into tradition. Adjacent to these spaces were rooms reserved for officials tasked with carrying out sentences. Executioners, guards, and clerics moved through separate corridors, unseen by the public. This separation preserved hierarchy. It ensured that violence remained impersonal. Stone absorbed blame so people did not have to. Some castles went further, incorporating rooms tied to astrological or religious timing. Medieval rulers often consulted astrologers before major decisions, including executions and imprisonments. Certain rooms were oriented to capture specific light at particular times of day or year. Windows aligned with solstices. Shafts illuminated specific symbols carved into walls. These were not decorative choices. They were statements of divine alignment. To act within these rooms was to act under heaven's gaze. Perhaps most unsettling are rooms connected to punishment after death. In medieval belief, execution did not end judgment. Bodies mattered. How they were treated affected the soul's fate. As a result, castles contained rooms where bodies were displayed, prepared, or deliberately denied proper burial. Some chambers were designed to hold corpses in public view, reinforcing authority even after death. Others concealed bodies entirely, ensuring disgrace followed the condemned into eternity. These rooms were cold, dry, and intentionally anonymous. No markers, no names. To be erased from memory was considered a fate worse than death. There are also rooms associated with vows and irreversible decisions. Some castles contained chambers where nobles swore oaths under threat of confinement or execution. The room itself acted as witness. Carvings invoked divine punishment for betrayal. Doors closed behind participants, sealing them in until the oath was spoken. Breaking such vows was believed to bring not only political consequences, but supernatural ones. The architecture reinforced this fear. The stone listened. The walls remembered. In a few documented cases, these oath rooms were later converted into prisons. The symbolism is unmistakable. Words became chains. As castles aged, their strange rooms accumulated layers of meaning. A chamber built for storage became a cell. A ritual room became a torture space. A listening chamber became a legend. Each generation added memory to stone, whether intentionally or not. Over time, purpose blurred. Fear lingered. Servants avoided certain corridors. Guards refused postings near specific rooms. Stories circulated. Whispers replaced records. When renovations occurred, some rooms were sealed rather than repurposed. It was easier to wall off discomfort than confront it. This is why modern archaeologists continue to discover hidden chambers with no clear explanation. Rooms filled with rubble, debris, or nothing at all. Spaces that were deliberately erased from use, but not destroyed. Silence became their final function. What ties all these strange rooms together is not cruelty alone, but belief. A belief that power must be demonstrated, that fear must be managed, that order requires sacrifice. Medieval castles were not built by accident. They were designed by people who understood that architecture could shape behavior as effectively as law or weaponry. The strangest rooms were not mistakes. They were solutions. They solved the problem of dissent, of disobedience, of uncertainty. They offered rulers tools to enforce authority when armies were unavailable and loyalty was fragile, and they worked. Even centuries later, these rooms unsettle us, not because of what happened within them, but because of how calmly they were created. There is no chaos in their design, no improvisation, only intention. That is what makes them truly disturbing. Today, tourists walk through castle corridors under bright lights. Signs explain history. Rooms are labeled, sanitized, safe. But beneath restored floors and reconstructed walls, the original logic remains. Stone remembers fear. Architecture preserves power. The strangest rooms in medieval castles are not relics of a barbaric past. They are mirrors. They reflect what happens when authority is unchecked, when belief overrides compassion, and when space itself becomes an instrument of control. Castles were meant to last forever, and in many ways they have. Their walls still stand. Their rooms still exist, and their silence still speaks, not of glory, but of what people were willing to build in order to rule. As castles grew more complex, so did the cruelty embedded within their walls. One of the most misunderstood spaces in medieval castles is the so-called dungeon. The word itself conjures images of chains, iron bars, and endless suffering. Yet true medieval dungeons were often far stranger than popular imagination suggests. Many were not underground at all. Some were placed high in towers, where isolation was absolute and escape impossible. Height replaced depth. Distance replaced darkness. These elevated prisons served a precise psychological function. Prisoners could hear life continuing below them, bells ringing, horses moving through courtyards, voices carried by the wind. Freedom was not absent. It was constantly nearby, yet unreachable. This form of imprisonment was deliberate torment, forcing captives to exist in a state of suspended hope. In certain castles, tower prisons were designed with windows that allowed just enough light to reveal the outside world. Fields, rivers, villages, normality. The prisoner was not forgotten. He was reminded. Then there were starvation rooms. Unlike oubliettes, these chambers were often temporary holding spaces used during sieges or political purges. They were small, sealed, and deliberately uncomfortable. Floors were slanted, walls pressed inward. Some were shaped almost like funnels, narrowing toward the ceiling. The architecture forced occupants into a hunched posture, making rest impossible. Records from medieval chroniclers describe prisoners losing their sense of time within days. Without windows, without sound cues, the body's internal rhythm collapsed. Guards would sometimes vary feeding times intentionally, reinforcing confusion. Hunger became secondary to disorientation. But starvation was not always physical. In several castles across England and France, historians have identified chambers now believed to have been used for sensory deprivation. These rooms were lined with wood or fabric, dampening sound. Light sources were minimal or indirect. Occupants were left alone for extended periods, sometimes weeks. The absence of stimulation produced hallucinations, panic, and eventual psychological collapse. What makes these rooms chilling is how advanced the understanding behind them appears. Medieval authorities may not have used modern terminology, but they understood human weakness instinctively. Silence could break a person faster than violence. Another category of strange spaces were execution preparation rooms. These chambers were not where death occurred, but where it was anticipated. Prisoners were held here in the hours or days before their execution. These rooms were often clean, well-lit, and almost ceremonial. The contrast was intentional. In some castles, condemned individuals were allowed to see the instruments of their death through small openings or partially open doors, not close enough to touch, just close enough to imagine. The waiting was the punishment. Adjacent to these rooms were spaces reserved for clergy. Medieval executions were deeply intertwined with religious ritual. Confession, repentance, and absolution were expected. Architecture reflected this. Narrow passages connected holding chambers to chapels, allowing prisoners to be moved unseen, preserving the illusion of order and mercy. Mercy, however, was optional. Some castles contained rooms designed for humiliation rather than confinement. Public shaming was a powerful tool in medieval society. Chambers with raised platforms allowed offenders to be displayed before crowds. Acoustics were engineered so that insults, confessions, or pleas carried clearly. The room amplified voices, ensuring no word was lost. These spaces were not reserved only for criminals. Political rivals, disgraced nobles, and even members of the ruling family could find themselves standing in these chambers. Rank offered no protection once power shifted. Then there were the rooms built for secrecy at the highest level. Council chambers in medieval castles often concealed secondary rooms hidden behind tapestries or false walls. These spaces allowed rulers to observe discussions without being seen. Decisions were shaped by information gathered in silence. Loyalty was tested without warning. In some cases, these hidden rooms contained nothing more than a narrow bench and a listening slit. In others, they were fully furnished, allowing prolonged observation. The knowledge that one might always be watched shaped behavior throughout the castle. Trust eroded. Self-censorship became survival. Beyond surveillance lay paranoia. Medieval rulers lived with the constant threat of assassination. Poisoning was a particular fear. As a result, castles contained rooms dedicated to food testing and isolation. Kitchens were often separated into multiple sections, with specific rooms for preparation, inspection, and approval. Access was restricted. Movement was monitored. Some castles included small chambers adjacent to dining halls where tasters waited. These rooms were bare, functional, and often unpleasant. The role of the taster was both essential and expendable. If poison was present, the room became a death sentence. Yet the strangest food-related rooms were those designed to conceal disposal. In castles where poisoning occurred, evidence had to vanish quickly. Secret drains, hidden shafts, and isolated pits allowed contaminated food or bodies to disappear without record. Stone absorbed guilt as easily as blood. Siege warfare introduced another category of disturbing spaces. During prolonged sieges, castles became pressure cookers. Supplies dwindled. Morale collapsed. In response, castles were designed with emergency rooms intended for extreme circumstances. Some chambers stored bodies temporarily when burial was impossible. Others were designated for the sick, isolated to prevent the spread of disease. These rooms were often poorly ventilated and hastily repurposed. Over time, they acquired reputations. Later generations avoided them. Legends grew. Whispers of curses and hauntings attached themselves to spaces that had once simply been practical responses to desperation. In several castles, sealed rooms discovered centuries later contained human remains that had never been recorded. No names, no dates, just bones behind stone. These finds suggest moments when order broke down completely, when documentation ceased to matter. Power is neat only when it is stable. One of the most enigmatic features found in medieval castles is the presence of child-sized rooms. These spaces are too small for adults to occupy comfortably and lack obvious storage functions. Their purpose remains unclear, but theories range from confinement of hostages to religious symbolism. In medieval politics, children were valuable leverage. Sons and daughters of rival nobles were often held as guarantees of loyalty. These rooms may have been designed to isolate young hostages, keeping them alive but controlled. The idea is disturbing not because of physical harm, but because of the calculated use of innocence as currency. There are also rooms associated with madness. Medieval understanding of mental illness was limited and heavily influenced by superstition. Individuals deemed unstable were often confined rather than treated. Some castles contained chambers specifically intended to restrain those considered dangerous or possessed. These rooms were reinforced with thick doors and minimal openings. Accounts describe chains fixed directly into stone, not as instruments of torture, but as permanent fixtures. The room itself became a cage. Soundproofing was crude but effective. Screams rarely escaped. In time, these spaces developed reputations that outlived their original purpose. Later occupants avoided them. Servants refused to enter alone. Architecture preserved memory long after people tried to forget. And then there were the rooms that served no logical purpose at all. Spaces with no furniture, no markings, no records. Rooms that seemed deliberately neutral, empty. These may be the most unsettling of all. In a world where every stone was placed with intention, emptiness stands out. Silence suggests choice. Some historians believe these rooms were left unfinished intentionally, as a form of architectural superstition. Others argue they were waiting spaces, placeholders for future needs never realized. Or perhaps they were meant to confuse, to obscure true layouts from enemies. In medieval castles, confusion was protection. As we move deeper into these structures, patterns emerge: fear of betrayal, fear of disorder, fear of the unknown. Every strange room is a response to one of these anxieties. Together, they form a map of medieval psychology etched into stone. But there remains one category of rooms that defies even these explanations. Rooms where cruelty and belief intersected so completely that purpose and ritual became indistinguishable. Rooms where punishment was not only enforced, but justified. And those rooms reveal more about the medieval mind than any battlefield ever could.